Mistika has many ways of blurring or defocusing shots, so let's have a look at the variety of effects available to us. They're all under the Effects tab, and they're mostly here. So let's just start off with the main blur effect. So I've got it over a wipe that's generating a box pattern, just so we can see what we're doing. And our main parameters down here allow us to choose the type of blur that we're going to use, where the blur is applied, whether we want to avoid rendering on the graphics card, but that's unusual, the amount of the blur, an offset to allow the blur to be non-circular, and a value to allow us to scale, which effectively allows us to define how much blur a given number here creates. So with default settings, we're in Gaussian blur and we're applying to the RG and B channels. So dragging up, we can see obviously we're getting a level of blur. Switching to box blur, we can see a slightly different effect. We can see how the blur is blurring only in X and Y and not in a circular pattern. Box blurs are generally faster to render, but on high values such as this you begin to see the edges appearing. Circle blur is much more similar to the sort of defocus you'd get from a camera lens. Switching back to Gaussian, we can see that it's not as soft. For the next three, it's probably easier to look at a real image rather than just the graphics of the wipe. A median defocus is actually a form of noise reduction, in that what it does is it joins together areas of similar colour, so you can see it's flattening down the various shades and colours in this image. So you can create some interesting cartoony effects with that. Grow basically builds out brighter areas and crushes in darker areas, and shrink does the opposite. So far we've been applying our blur to the RG and B channels equally, but we have a number of controls as to where we can place our blurs. So the next one down is RGB in alpha. In other words, only blur inside the alpha channel. I don't have an alpha channel on here at the moment, so I'll quickly create one by just adding a circle wipe. Wipe patterns with a single input will apply their pattern to the alpha channel. So now we have an alpha channel like this on that particular image. So with this mode selected, we can see that we're only blurring inside the alpha channel itself. Next one down, blurring chrominance only, leaving luminance sharp. So you can see it's blurring the coloured part of the image. And similarly in alpha as before. Or we can just blur the individual channels one at a time, so just blurring the red channel. Again, get some interesting effects by doing this sort of thing. We can also just blur the alpha channel. So if we look at our alpha, we can see the blur is only being applied to the alpha channel, whereas actually the master image is being left alone. In fact, that's exactly the same as this function here, blur alpha, which we looked at in the keying tutorials. Blurring in RGB and A is just as it suggests, it blurs all the channels together, as opposed to this one which would have left the alpha channel alone. Then foreground blur is identical to this one here, which again we looked at in the keying tutorials. It's a very specific kind of blur designed for blurring a foreground object that you're then cutting out and keying onto a background. Then finally there's RGB radius of alpha. Now on first sight it appears to be doing the same thing of blurring just inside the alpha channel, the same as this. But in fact there's a subtle difference. This is blurring the shot and then using the alpha channel to key the blurred shot over the sharp shot. On the other hand, this one is taking the value of the alpha channel and using it to drive the defocus effect. So the higher the value of the alpha channel, the whiter the alpha channel, the stronger the defocus. So we can see that in action. If I just look at the multiplication of the alpha channel, and I'm just going to move the matte to intersect that face, and then I'm just going to soften the edge of that matte. So we have that as our alpha channel. So now if we go back to the blur, with RGB radius of alpha, when we blur, what's effectively happening is we're getting a soft transition. Where our alpha channel is black, no blurring is taking place. And where our alpha channel is white, this amount of blurring is taking place. Where our alpha channel is grey, half of this amount is taking place. So you get a smooth transition. If on the other hand we go to RGB in alpha, then what we're effectively getting is a blurred version being keyed over a sharp version. So you can see it's more of a mix between two settings rather than a gradual increase in the blur level. Let's just go back to having blurs on the graphic pattern. Anamorphic allows us to make the blur non-circular. So we can use this to compensate if we're working with anamorphic images, but also at its extremity, being minus 100 or plus 100, you can see that the blur is happening only in one direction. If we did want directional blur to create streaks or camera pans, then in fact we have just that here, one below, directional blur. So directional blur is very simple, the amount that we want to blur and the direction we want to blur in. Remember that if we created a move in the Comp 3D, then there's a function inside there to automatically make the motion blur follow the motion that you've animated. This is actually quite useful for making little camera shakes using the math function. So in maths, I'm going to type in random 10 as an amount, and then random 360 as an angle. So that would have created these curves. Then the effects I have is I've created a camera shake. Going back to effects, one down is radial blur, similar to directional blur, but this one is designed for doing crash zoom effects, where it'll zoom out from a given point. It'll also rotate around a point as well. This is also quite useful for creating light beams and that sort of thing. So maybe we start with a title. Perhaps give it some animation angle. And I'll make a copy of it and add radial blur to 1. And we can build up an effect by adding that back to the original perhaps to get this sort of thing. Perhaps just make that a bit more interesting. We'll blur the original, add some color correction as well. So you get the idea. Slope blur is an interesting one, worth a play with. As the manual says, it doesn't have an optical equivalent. In other words, it's just a bit of a fun effect. So it'll make blurry rotations around particular boundaries. So you can do some pretty surreal stuff with it. And in fact, it'll take two inputs. The first input is the one it'll blur, and the second one is the image it will look at to create the map for the blurring. At the moment, it's just using the same image, but it's quite interesting playing around with different images to get different effects. Also, part of that section is sharpen, which is pretty obvious how it works. You can choose which algorithm you use from here and give it an amount, and you can see that the edges are being crispened up. To effect a sharpening effect. And one other type of blur that isn't in this section, because it's actually part of optical flow, is over here, optical motion blur. This one works slightly differently in that with directional blur we specified an angle for the blur and that happened over the whole frame. With optical motion blur, Mistika tracks all the pixels in the frame to work out where everything is going, and then by adjusting the shutter time here we can add in natural motion blur based on the actual direction of travel. Another interesting function here, actually not to do with blurs as such, but just while we're here, is if I switch the shutter time down to 0, which means that I'm not adding any motion blur, the function next to it is shutter phase, and actually this allows me to choose a position in between frames. It's a shutter timer. So this can be useful if you need to ever synchronize two cameras, for example, that are out of sync but by less than one frame. That sometimes happens in 3D work, but also another use for this is working with high dynamic range cameras, such as the Red Epic, which can take two exposures at the same time, one longer than the other. So you get a bright picture and a dark picture. And by combining the two you end up with an extra high dynamic range image. The problem is the shutter timings are obviously slightly different. So this is a function where you can match one shutter to the other and then add in motion blur for the shorter shutter to match the longer one. There's one other thing to look at, and here I have a piece of simple CGI and a depth matte. So this is a depth matte generated by the CGI where the whitest object is furthest away and the closest object is dark. Now in theory I would be able to use this with our blur radius of alpha by connecting these two together so that this becomes the alpha channel for this, and then going for our blur. And if we set our mode to radius and alpha, we can now make a defocus based on the distance of the object from the camera. The problem is we're lacking a control here, because this radius will always be driven by the value of the alpha channel, i.e. the closest object is always going to be the thing that's more in focus, and I don't have a control here to change that position or to affect a pull focus through the scene. But as ever with Mistika, there's always a way around. So what I'll do is I'll add in a solid and channels, and I'll tell channels that I want to see the difference between that solid and the depth mat. So that's done for the red channel. I'm now just going to go Control C for copy, and now Control V on the green and the blue to make sure that they're all doing the same thing. Because now what I'll get out of channels is something that reacts to this, because channels is giving me the difference between the colour I've set here and the particular shade on the depth mat. So we can see that I can use this potentially to pull focus through the image, and I've got a convenient slider to do it. So looking again at the blur, but controlling the solid, we can see that we can pull focus through our scene. So those are all the options to blur and defocus shots within Mistika.